Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Professor Anil Seth. Hi Anil, how are you doing?
Hi, Tom. I'm well, thank you.
Good, fantastic. I wonder, Anil, if you could speak a little bit more to what brings you to this conversation around kind of AI and humanity, please.
Well, my research interest for many years now, decades really, has all been about consciousness. This one of the oldest questions in the book, certainly one of the most challenging. How does anything made of stuff give rise to a conscious experience? And I've been interested in approaching this from perspective of neuroscience, from philosophy, but also from artificial intelligence. My PhD was in AI back before you could make a lot of money by having those kinds of skills. And there's often been this question, and this is a question that goes back not only in academia, but in film, in novels, in culture, in religion too, hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, Frankenstein arguably asked the question, could a human-made creation be conscious? And we've seen this theme recur throughout science fiction, certainly, but in literature as well, with Ishiguro, it's brilliant books. And I mean, this emphasizes this question of whether something that we humans can create could be conscious. I mean, this is something that is not only scientifically and philosophically challenging, but culturally, ethically, and morally complicated as well. So I'm very interested in where all these currents come together and swirl around. And in the present moment, we've seen such an explosion of interest in artificial intelligence, especially with the rise of generative AI and language models, which makes these questions really important in the here and now, because people are saying all kinds of things about whether AI is conscious or could be conscious. And these opinions make a difference. They make a difference to how we interact with AI, how it affects us, and it also makes a difference to the kinds of AI we might want to develop, the kinds of regulation we might envisage, and many other decisions that extend beyond the remit of just how neural networks work.
Fantastic. It sounds like you're definitely the right person to have for this conversation then. How do you think that AI challenges our understanding of consciousness and humanity?
Challenges our understanding in several ways. Because we don't understand how consciousness happens. I mean, I think that's worth just putting on the table at the beginning. We have theories now and we have experiments. We know a lot more than we did. But the core question of how is it that a bunch of biological neurons and the other stuff we have in our brains and bodies, how is it that anything that a system like that can do can amount to any conscious experience, the redness of red or the taste of a piece of cheese? I mean, this is still mysterious. So given that, there's always going to be a bit of lack of clarity about what other things in our universe have consciousness. There's a lot of debate about non-human animals, emerging biotechnologies like organoids, but in particular, AI. Now, the case of AI in particular challenges a couple of things. One is this idea that consciousness is a matter of computation. This is a very, very common assumption throughout philosophy, neuroscience, and AI, that the brain is a kind of computer, maybe a very sophisticated kind, and that cognition and also consciousness, not only what brains do, but what it feels like to be a brain doing something, these are matters of computation. Now, this is a very common assumption, and it might be wrong. It might be right, but there are actually a number of reasons to think it might be wrong. And AI is putting pressure on addressing this question, because if computation is sufficient for consciousness, then consciousness is something that AI could in principle have. It doesn't mean it has it yet, but it means it could have it. But if it isn't, and if consciousness is something that is really more fundamentally tied to what brains and bodies are made out of, then the best AI can do can give us the strong impression of being conscious rather than actually itself realizing or instantiating consciousness. So it puts pressure on this fundamental question. And the other thing I think it does is it exposes some of the biases that we have. Now, we humans, we are very anthropocentric. We put ourselves at the center of everything, and we're very anthropomorphic. We tend to project human-like qualities into other things. on the basis of sometimes superficial similarities. And we're really seeing this with language models now, right? So language models speak to us. And because of our human anthropocentrism, we tend to take language as a signature of all kinds of human-like things, not only linguistic ability, but intelligence in general, and also consciousness. And intelligence and consciousness are different things. You know, they come together in us humans, but conceptually, intelligence is, you know, solving problems flexibly. Consciousness is having any kind of experience. So our tendency to attribute consciousness to things can often reflect our psychological biases rather than actually what's happening.
As you're talking, it's making me think about almost what does it mean to be human, which is something we speak a lot to our students about on the module as well. Lots of the discussions tend to be around how AI lacks kind of common sense. And I wonder, do you think that reveals, well, first of all, do you agree that it lacks kind of common sense? And in the same way that defining what consciousness is, actually defining common sense becomes very difficult when you start to think about what that is. But I wonder if you, do you think this idea of AI lacking this common sense, do you think that reveals much about kind of human intuition and knowledge, and as part of a bigger discussion about understanding ourselves?
Potentially, yeah. I think it's first important to, again, understand that although common sense and consciousness kind of come together in us human beings, they don't necessarily come together in principle. So, you know, one can imagine that some future AI system has human level, or perhaps hopefully even better than human level common sense, because our so-called common sense goes wrong very often. And we'll come back to that, I think. Without any kind of consciousness at all. There might be nothing it is like to be an AI system with common sense. That said, what are the prospects even for AI that has common sense? I mean, this is something that AI researchers have tried to do for decades, right? There was an old project called the Psych Project, I think many years ago, where the goal was to program in all the basic facts that supposedly underpinned human common sense, you know, things that float, things that don't float, you know, don't try and walk through a closed door, things like that that seem obvious to us. We don't have to think about them, but you know, AI systems in general don't come equipped with this kind of common sense knowledge. Now, I think it's possible that, in principle, that something like common sense is something that an artificial system could have. What it would require is a more difficult question. You know, could it just be an extrapolation of current technologies? Like language models are getting better at this kind of thing, but they're still, you know, one can still trip them up. My feeling is that what's needed is embodiment and embeddedness, that a lot of our common sense reasoning comes not from just disembodied abstract thinking about things or remembering things, but through a history of interacting with a world through a body. And we don't really have that in AI yet, though it is happening. Robotics is beginning to advance as well.
A key phrase you brought up was embodied. And I was thinking about embodied cognition as you were talking. And I wonder, are there any qualities of human consciousness that you think might be impossible, perhaps, to replicate in an AI system?
Well, I'm pretty much out on a limb on this. I mean, I'm trying to steel man the position that all of our consciousness depends on our nature as embodied living systems, that it might be a necessary condition for consciousness. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I think there are some good reasons to believe it, that consciousness is something that might really be grounded in fundamental life processes like metabolism and the tendency or the imperative that living systems have to keep regenerating their own material basis. I mean, we are very different from machines in many ways. If you look inside a brain, there's no sharp distinction between what you call the mindware and the wetware, as you'll find in a computer, between the hardware and the software. And that lack of a distinction suggests to me that it's very hard to justify the idea that what we're made out of just doesn't matter, that we're just kind of meat-based computers, and the fact that we're made out of neurons and cells just is kind of implementation detail that you can forget about. But then there are particular kinds of conscious experiences that I think are much more closely tied to embodiment than others. I'm thinking here mainly of emotion. Emotional experiences can be thought of, I think, really usefully as really kinds of perceptions of the body's physiological condition. This goes back in in psychology more than 100 years to William James and Carl Langer. But in my view and in some of the work that I've been doing, I tend to think of emotional experiences as like perceptions. They're the brain's best guesses of what's happening inside our body. And so they are fundamentally embodied experiences.
Understanding AI requires we understand ourselves, and that holds almost across the piece in terms of how we're programming AI and the biases that are inherent within our decision making. And do you program that into AI when you're discussing ethics and bias and everything else? It really makes you look at the human condition. And I wonder with that, I mentioned around kind of ethics and bias. Can you see ethical implications that could arise as a result of these human-like AI?
There are lots of ethical implications, and they fall into two categories. And I think it's critically important to separate these categories, which is something that's sometimes not done. So on the one side, we have the ethical implications of creating a conscious machine or synthetic consciousness of some kind. It doesn't have to be human-like, but any kind of artificial system that has the potential for experience. Now, in most ethical moral frameworks, anything that has consciousness has some kind of moral considerability, that it has its own interests and not merely the interest that we give it now. It may have the potential for pain, it may have frustrated preferences, and so on. So the ethical implications of actually building conscious AI are really profound and very disturbing. We could create artificial consciousness at an industrial scale at the flicker of a switch, and this in general is a really bad idea. Frankenstein shows us there's all kinds of science fiction make this point very well. And it's strange because sometimes you hear this as a sort of blasé goal that, hey, wouldn't it be great to develop artificial consciousness? I think it would be a terrible, terrible mistake, terrible idea. Fortunately, I don't think it's possible, at least not on current trajectories. But there are another class of ethical challenges that come with AI systems that mimic consciousness, and especially that mimic human-like consciousness. The ethical challenges here are very different. I mean, they range from things like we humans can become more psychologically vulnerable when we're interacting with systems that give us the impression that, for instance, they really care about us or they really understand us. I worry about this with sort of digital avatars that have been created these days that say things that the real person might not say. So that's one class of problems. I think a more subtle ethical challenge here is how do we treat things that seem conscious even though they aren't? And we might even know that they're not, but we might be unable to stop feeling that they are. And it seems like we have two options. On the one hand, we treat them well, as if they are conscious. We're polite to Siri and we ask our AI before turning it off for the night, things like that. You might think no harm done, that's fine, just a precautionary thing. But of course, we have a limited kind of amount of moral capital we can expend, and we tend to have a kind of in-group, out-group psychology too. So if we bring things like AI in because it seems to us to be conscious, language models that speak to us, then other things are going to be left on the outside that might actually deserve our moral considerability because they really do have the potential for experiencing things like suffering. Or we decide to not care about these things, even though they still give us the impression of being conscious. And this takes us into the territory that Immanuel Kant called the brutalism, not the form of architecture, but the idea that we might brutalize our minds. It's if we treat things as if they don't have feelings, even though it seems to us that they do, that's a psychologically very unhealthy place to be. Again, a fantastic example of this in science fiction is Westworld. I mean, that's all about exploring the implications on human beings when they're encouraged to treat things, human-like things, as if they're not conscious, and things don't turn out well without giving too much away for those who haven't seen it. So there's no good options here. It's going to be difficult either way, but it gets particularly difficult when we confuse these two ethical categories. You might be tempted to say, oh, if they're not actually conscious, there's no ethical problem. Wrong. There are still ethical problems, but they are different ethical problems.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, and it's making me consider almost how we can navigate that boundary between simulated and genuine consciousness in AI development. I wonder if do you have any thoughts on ways that we might be able to navigate that? I appreciate you said that genuine consciousness may be beyond us at the moment, but your point about this line of even simulated consciousness can have a real challenge for us and how we react to it and respond to it. So do you have any thoughts on navigating that boundary, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there are things we can do. And I think the first thing is to try to just avoid this, in my mind, rather naive goal that what we should be doing in AI is to develop human-like general artificial intelligence with all the attributes that we humans have, including things like consciousness. I mean, this again is just a spectacularly bad idea, as history has sort of repeatedly shown us. We should instead recognize, I think, that AI has enormous positive potential, but not in the sense of replacing human beings. A lot of our fears about AI come from that too. The idea that we're going to be replaced, singularities, and AI bootstrapping itself beyond our understanding and control, and rather think of AI systems as ways to augment and complement human cognition rather than replace it. Daniel Dennett, who was a great philosopher and a mentor of mine who sadly died last year, I mean, he had this, I think, really nice way of putting it that said we should always remember that AI systems are tools and not colleagues, and not kid ourselves that they're our colleagues, and nothing like that. Always remember that difference. And I think that gives us some kind of design space in which we can work. How do we design systems so that they complement some of our own cognitive weaknesses? And we talked about common sense earlier, but we're really bad, for instance, thinking through the consequences of things that happen over long time scales or broad spatial scales, which is why collectively we're really bad at handling things like climate change. So under what situations can we develop systems that compensate for our weaknesses without giving us the impression that they are us? I think the second thing here to say is that it really does us ourselves no favors too. These systems, they're incredibly impressive these days, but so are we. So are biological creatures, not only humans but other animals. And I have the feeling that if we project ourselves too readily into these kinds of AI systems, we kind of diminish what it is to be a human being. And I think we need to understand how rich, how incredible, how distinctive human cognition and consciousness is. It's so much more than a language model, however impressive a language model really is. So part of it is thinking, well, what kind of AI systems do we want? And part of it is, let's redouble our efforts to understand ourselves better and resist the temptation to reduce what it is to be us to whatever the most convenient current technological metaphor might be.
Almost every answer that we've gone through in some way or another requires us to reflect on what it means to be human. Every single discussion around kind of the future of AI and our interaction with it is thinking about, you just said, the complexity of biological machines is up there. We tend to, I don't want to say take it for granted, but almost to an extent, we're sitting there with large language models going, look how incredible and complicated this is. But look how incredible and complicated being human is. Have you given any thought to how these developing AI systems may change the way that we interact, not only with each other, but also the world around us? You mentioned about helping us with our limitations around kind of spatial thinking and long-term thinking, but I wonder if you've given any other kind of consideration for how it might change those interactions.
It's a very good question. Here I'm speculating a little bit. So I think there are definitely ways in which AI systems will change human-to-human interactions. And here again, I think we have to be very careful in understanding how rich human-to-human interactions can be, because these human AI interactions can be sort of seductively easy. AI systems don't shout at you; they don't necessarily argue with you. You can talk to them fairly easily. I mean, that can provide some opportunities, but it's a very different beast. So there's ways in which human interactions will be altered. I mean, I have a hope here that as new generations develop in the context of these language models being available, it might be a little bit like learning two different languages that you can readily begin to distinguish in a way that older people find it harder, because we haven't grown up in a context where we have these two different kinds of linguistic interactions happening simultaneously. I wouldn't want to rely on that hope, but I think it's important to recognize the optimistic possibilities as well as the pessimistic possibilities. Now, how AI systems might change our interaction with the world in general, well, I think you can kind of just extrapolate out from human-human interactions. So human-animal interactions is another thing. And here, again, I worry that if we bring AI systems within our circle of moral considerability, then we may be less likely to bring deserving non-human animals within that circle as well. If we put an emphasis on language and say, oh, that's what matters, then non-linguistic creatures might not. Of course, nothing is that simple. One of the really exciting projects in AI is the use of machine learning to decode animal communication. There's a number of projects. The Earth Species Project is the one I know the best. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. Of course, it's been a dream for a long time of talking to animals. But again, this is rife with so many ethical issues. Like, how do we know how to trust whatever the machine says they're saying? And are we not just imposing a kind of human cognitive frame on these animals anyway? What if they don't turn out to say anything we judge as particularly interesting? What will that do to how we treat them? So there's a lot up for grabs. And I think it's all about how we navigate these fundamental psychological biases of seeing the world through this human-centered lens, and how human-like AI might amplify those biases and distorts our ability to care for and interact with the rest of the natural world.
It's a fascinating reflection, that idea of using AI to decode language in animals, because we spoke about cognition earlier, but the cognition of, let's say, a lion or a tiger would mean that even the way that we understand language, and you're right about how we understand it, would surely be very different in an animal. They wouldn't conceptualize things in the same way. I really like the idea of, are we just imposing ourselves on that, and what are the ethics that come with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's another long-running debate in cognitive science is the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea that language shapes cognition, that it constrains the ways in which we think, not only constrains our ability to describe the world, but constrains the way we experience and think about the world. So different human languages might actually lead to different ways of thinking. And if that can be true within the human family, then yeah, I mean, it seems very likely that non-human experience would be fundamentally different if it's shaped by even if it's a non-linguistic cognitive architecture.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point for us to pick up on, and this idea of AI being used to kind of mediate different aspects of these interactions, I think is a really pressing one that, again, we've spoken to our students about a lot in terms of their future careers and their future relationships and things like that. And I wonder, do you think the kind of increasing AI mediation of things like our relationships, just with ourselves for now, not with animals, but just with ourselves, do you think that increased mediation will have an impact on things like empathy and emotional intelligence, where you mentioned about the different languages that perhaps future generations will learn? Can you see it having an impact? Can you see it being a positive or a negative, or maybe both?
I think probably both. I think there's a lot of experimental work that needs to be done on the effect of interacting with AI on things like empathy, emotional response, the beliefs that we have about things. I mean, a lot of this can be done now. I mean, people are spending a lot of time interacting with these systems. So instead of, or as well as pontificating about it, I think we just need to know what the fact of the matter is. And there's already a bunch of studies looking at the tendency of people to attribute beliefs, understanding, consciousness to artificial systems. And so I think we need a lot more of that in order to understand the landscape as it is, and the landscape as it might well be. I think there will always be positive and negative aspects. I mean, it's very easy to focus on the disadvantages, because sometimes they're just overlooked by a kind of boosterism that you find in the tech industry. But at the same time, these technologies can be incredibly transformative, and they can do a huge amount of good, not only in solving complex problems like designing new drugs, whatever, but also I think in enabling more adaptive human-to-human interactions too. Just as the ability to translate between different languages allowed different cultures to allow them to get, didn't guarantee they'd get on, of course. There's a whole history where that didn't happen. But yeah, things can go either way, and I think it's a combination of experimental work and careful design so that we become aware, we design these technologies in order to maximize the possibility of positive outcomes and minimize the possibility of negative ones, which is easy to say, of course, harder to do.
Yeah, but it's a good aim to have, and one that we should hopefully keep in mind when developing these things. Thank you, Anil. One last question, and it's just, what do you see as the most important steps that we can take to ensure a positive future with AI?
The most important positive step, from my perspective, and those might not be the most important in general, is to understand ourselves better. Like, I do not think we'll be able to generate the kind of AI that will be maximally socially positive unless we understand our own minds, bodies, brains, consciousness better. That seems to me to be an absolutely essential step in figuring out what kind of AI we should want.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anil. It's a really, really interesting and thoughtful answer. And thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Look forward to speaking to you again soon, and good luck with all of your work.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it.